Hey folks, it's Chris with Microsoft, aka Big Daddy Nines. Welcome to another exciting episode of the Performance Series. In our last episode, we talked about a little bit of memory stuff, and we're still talking about it. In fact, we kind of ran out of time, and I didn't get to do everything I wanted to do in that last episode prior to running beyond like the 45-minute mark, and I really was trying to keep these videos no longer than about 35 minutes, so we're going to pick up and cover a couple things we missed there. As a reminder, the last one was mostly about RAM and Pagefile exhaustion. What happens when a process goes and runs up his commit limit or the committed bytes and goes and overwhelms the system. So we talked about both just committing memory, and we talked about committing and touching memory and what that looks like when the system starts to thrash. We also turned the page file down, and that was one of the things I was looking at just as we started filming here, making sure that the page file was still set so it doesn't go any higher than a gig. It gives us a couple of little pieces. This episode is mostly going to be about RAM exhaustion as opposed to the previous episode. Mostly what we'll be talking about is what happens when you just ran out of RAM instead of RAM and page file, which happens when a system process, or not a system process, just any process, any application running on the box, goes in and locks its pages into memory, which it can do. So we're going to go ahead and run a couple little tests here to pick up where we were from the last one, just to cover a couple little things. RAM, when it just runs out of RAM, it's a little less common. It's not a prevalent thing as when you're tracking a typical memory leak. Typical memory leak by a process is going to lose RAM and page file, and so your percent of committed bytes in use is going to go way up. But this is a little less frequent, so this is going to take a little less time to do. So that's good because we're going to have some overflow from the previous episode. So the first thing I want to do here is I want to go in and go into our test limit folder here, and again show the options for test limit. So what we looked at before here, you remember, is we had a couple of little switches, right? For the -E switch, for instance, was a very useful tool here because -E can give us like number of seconds that we're doing. And we also had the inadvertent but very fortunate mistake where I said leaking just memory versus leaking the leak and touch, where it actually was being very leaky application. And then later what we're going to be using is the virtual lock, right? So for now we're going to go back to what we did here with the -M. And the reason we're going to do that is because we want to, now that we have the page file set in a way that it is, just get zoom back out here so we can kind of look at what's going on. Now that we have the page file locked, we should be able to exhaust this thing and actually get the error that I was looking at. So we'll go ahead and do the test limit, and we'll go ahead and do the -M. And let's just leak it in 1 meg chunks, but we're not going to do the -E so that we can force it to take little bitty chunks of memory and little bitty chunks of memory and continue to ask the OS to commit the memory, even though it won't touch it, just like we did. And we're going to see if we can get this error that comes up, especially on Windows 8 systems, very frequently. So we should see the commit charge go up to 100%. We should be able to come over here, and you see that it very quickly ran the commit limit to the edge, and sadly I wasn't able to get the error message to pop up this time that I was hoping for. But let's see, yeah, it's too small for this operation. It's not able to consume any more committed bytes. But again, as a review, this isn't taking up actual physical memory, right? So whoa, why did you zoom? Do not zoom. Escape. And see why does it keep doing that? Strange little funkiness. Yeah, that was beautiful. Okay. As I was trying to launch the Zoom It application, what happened was, and hang on a second, let me get this log back in here. Yeah, right here. Okay, so typically what you're going to see is a handful of things. Number one, you're going to get error messages that indicate that you've run out of memory. It doesn't really tell you what kind of memory. It's a little exclamation point pop up on a Windows 8 or higher box. You don't see it quite as often on the servers because you're not logged into them, right? And it didn't really happen at all on previous versions of Windows Server and Windows Client operating systems. The newer ones, what they'll do is they'll warn you and they'll tell you, hey, we've got a really bad amount of consumption going on right here. You need to close the processes. Typically, what that is actually running out of commit limit. You've run your commit limit. You've run your committed bytes to the commit limit is the better way to say that. And what that means is the OS can't commit any extra memory at this point. So what has happened to me here is the box has logged me off because I did the 1 meg and I left the system with absolutely nothing left that it could recover from. And with the 1 meg of memory, it took every bit. It didn't even have like 10 megs or 9 megs in the interim there, and it's now left me with non-ability. The reason it logged me off, and now I've logged back on here. The reason that it logged me completely off in this case was because when it would normally have a warning of such. I can't even get my mouse to move in this sucker. Telling me that it needed to close out. I launched another application. In this case, I did some stuff with Zoomit, and that caused it to users not be able to honor that request, and it forced me to log off. So that's another thing you might get from your users who are saying, hey, what's the deal here? I just suddenly got logged off. Well, that condition may actually be caused by an exhaustion of memory. So my profile was logged out, and now I'm logged back in. Maybe we can get it to, let's try one more test, and then I'm going to give up on this. Let's just do -m and 10 megs and see if I can. Let's get the task manager up so we can actually see this occurring, because once we start this, there's no going back and launching new applications, obviously. Go ahead and do that. So now let's run up all the committed bytes. We have not actually seen the error. Yeah, probably not going to be able to do it. There we go. Okay, so this is a very common user complaint as well. What it's saying is computer's low on memory. Again, it does not really tell you, what memory necessarily it is out of. But in this window here, you're getting that you need to close that particular program, and it's telling what program it wants to close. Right? Because I gave it a little more room with the 10 megs than I did with the 1 meg, this thing had enough to generate, and it hasn't actually just forced me to log the profile completely out. So that's two different conditions you'll see. But what's really bizarre to people who haven't seen this before, where they get confused, is they can tell they've got plenty of memory. It's saying right here that you are out of memory. But over here on the left in Task Manager, it's showing that we've got plenty of memory available. It's got 1.3 gigs available. If you can, I don't have Zoomit running, but I'll bet if I try to run it, it's probably going to freak out. Let's give it a shot, though. Let's see what happens here if I fire off the Zoomit and try to get my little happy drawing application going. Nope, it's going to log me off again. So trying to launch a new app. It was warning me, try to close another program, but then when I surpassed its ability to cope, it then forced me to log off. So these are the kind of examples that you'll get from your users. Okay, so we're going to get logged back in, and I'm also going to go ahead and really quickly close this virtual machine out and then reconnect to it. And we'll go to 1024 by 768. And there we go. Okay. So another thing that we didn't actually do that we need to do is I left out a very important piece of information for you guys. When we were talking about percent of committed bytes in use, I'd mentioned that is your actual key indicator that you would use to determine, hey, what did my box run out of? If you'll remember the troubleshooting flow, we'll cover it again really fast. What you're doing is you've got this capture that you've been running over a period of time that covered a point of failure when whatever problem it is that you were having happened. And you're going to be loading up some initial key indicators to determine what happened to your system. And we've already covered the average disk per second read and average disk per second write. That'll tell you if you're getting disk latency, right? And then in the previous episode, we talked about percent of committed bytes in use. I told you the thresholds for the disk counter. Kind of forgot to talk about the committed bytes counter. Right, so we definitely want to know what those are. So here they are, 60% right here. When you start seeing yourself get over 60% of percent of committed bytes in use, you want to be a little concerned. We need to start setting up our warnings and being concerned about memory at 80%. So those are your thresholds for the percent of committed bytes in use counter. Okay, so let's clear that out. Now in the previous episode we created a secondary user-defined data collector set, and we used a template, practicing using that skill. So we're going to be doing a couple of different data collectors in here. Let's make sure we have the ones we have. Now you notice that I made a mistake. I did annotate the previous footage, but I accidentally put in available bytes instead of available megabytes. So we're going to pull that out and put the correct counter in. When you're filming a video, you're kind of only half able to concentrate on what you're saying sometimes, and half concentrating on how the video's going and what you're going to cover. So available megabytes or Mbytes counter is a much better counter to use than available bytes. They both work. They both will function just fine. All right, so I said we were going to be concentrating on the loss of RAM in this episode. So we want to make sure we have some stuff in here, like committed bytes, commit limit, committed bytes in use, just to use as comparators. Pages per second, just as a kind of a nice handy little thing that we might look at. Page file percent of usage, private bytes, the working set, available megabytes counter that we just added back in. Those are really the biggies. That's kind of what we need. You know, one other thing we could do, we'll stick with that. All right, so we're going to go ahead and toss that down to a 3-second interval, and we're going to start this thing up, and we're going to fire off our test limit little guy here, and do another terrible, horrible thing to our box, and fire off test limit. And this time we're going to do first and foremost, let's get our task manager up so we can see what it looks like to troubleshoot this problem live versus troubleshooting this problem after the fact using perfmon. And of course we'll have the better tool, resource monitor, and we probably should have something like process monitor up or process explorer up as well, because that's a much better tool than even resource monitor is per se, but this is still a really good tool. We've already covered what all this stuff means, so we don't have to rehash all of that, but now that we've got all our great stuff going here, we'll look at those options one more time real quick, because we need to know which one that does the virtual lock, and we'll see that -V has the virtual lock. So we're going to do the test limit, -V for virtual lock. We've been using 10 a lot, so we'll just stick with that. And 1 second. So every 1 second it should steal 10 megabytes, and let's go look at the difference. We should see in Task Manager that we're consuming more and more RAM. And we may, that's probably aggressive enough. I was thinking maybe I can't. Definitely got the pattern of a leak. Let's go to Resource Monitor and kind of look at what that looks like. As you can see, the in-use memory is going up. And if I were to look at the working set of the processes, test limit is the biggest guy. And we can see that we have now exhausted free memory. We're now consuming standby memory, because standby memory, once again, is kind of like your system cache for processes that have opened and have recently closed. And you can see that if we were to look at test limit, his working set and the commit limit are both going up. His private bytes are going up, and used physical memory over on the right over here has got a very good leak. I don't know what that is I just drew. It's a very good leak indicate there. And we're also hitting the commit charge as well. It wouldn't matter if we had the page file set or not to increase beyond 1 gigs, because we aren't actually, as we'll see in a minute, going to page file change this thing because all of my stuff is actually already, all of this process is actually consuming RAM only because we're locking those pages in RAM. And importantly, we may actually see some page file activity because right about now, the virtual memory manager, and there it is, right there on the graph, if you noticed on the commit charge, what is actually happening there is it is dropping or giving itself more page file, but that's not for this process. That is for other processes, right? So it's actually paging out a whole lot of other things that have been running on this system. And okay, we should be getting about to the top of where this guy can get. Yeah, so he's at 12. He's still crooking. We'll still let him cook. But you'll notice the difference this time. We are seeing some paging going over in the commit charge. You can see the commit charge in the middle graph on the right is doing its kind of wafering thing. But you'll notice that the process over here in the graph, the private bytes, the working set, and the commit limit are all about the same. Which means that he is locking in RAM. Otherwise, we'd see a delta between the commit limit and the actual private bytes. And the reason we know that is because the commit limit does include any memory that's been paged out or is no longer in RAM. It includes everything. This machine will eventually become completely unresponsive as soon as he gets to the point where he can no longer put things in the page file. And once the commit limit has been achieved, the box becomes pretty much useless, and we probably have gotten there now because I no longer see any activity on the box going. Now, what's actually happened is the machine is probably still semi-quasi-alive, and I just can't see it. It is a virtual machine. It's not a machine I have physical hardware attached to. So there is a process that has to function to be able to send out-of-box type or out-of-band type signals back to the hypervisor so that it can tell. So if I were trying to remote desktop into this system, I wouldn't be able to do so because there's just no system resources left on this sucker. So essentially this box is pretty well dead to me. In fact, I probably can't actually connect to it anymore using Hyper-V. I could try though, and let's see if it lets me in. But the reality is we have probably toasted this machine, which is exactly what we'd intended to do. Because we leaked out all the RAM, he continued to increase the page file and put as many of the processes that were not logging pages in RAM, and he continued to shove as many of those out of memory as possible to make room. And instead, he, once he hit the gig limit that we set for him in the last episode for the page file increasing, he went off the rails. So this is a dead box. For all intents and purposes, the only way I could get to it is if I could plug a keyboard, a mouse, and a monitor into it, and I could probably actually get the mouse to move around, which I can't do because this is not a physical box, right? So what do? Well, obviously, we do what we always do. Turn it off. We'll shut that guy down, and then we'll bring him back up, and we can do a post-mortem on him. Post-mortem. Dead VM. Dig up the body. And I'll pause the video while he starts to boot up. Alright, it's back up. Someone has called your team or called you in some way or another and said, hey, my machine keeps locking up or has locked up or this server locked up. However that comes to you, it has now come to you, and now you're investigating. So what we would do is, if we were fortunate, we had a data collector set running, like a black box, which again we will be talking about, and you can go back and pull that so that you can look at what happened. So let's go and see if we got data, which hopefully we did. Go ahead and blue cube this thing. Go back to our memory. Test 2 this time. And pull them up, and let's drop in some counters. So if we were doing in key indicators, and we looked at memory, percentage bytes in use and available megabytes obviously were very important counters. We should see that. Get my available megabytes scale down here. Oh, this is really good. See how available megabytes is right up here at the top of the screen and completely anchored. This is a very good time to scale that counter so that we can see it, because that's a whole lot different than the other, right? When it was sitting up on the top, it did not look like a memory leak at all. Well, now it looks like a memory leak. In fact, if we wanted to maybe put that to 0.1 instead of 1, we can really see the memory leak pattern here. Now we did in fact hit 0 at some point in here, but I think at that point perfmon was no longer able to read data. But this is a pretty clear indicator. We got down to about a minimum of 82 megabytes of memory, and that's really not enough for a system to continue to operate. So that's bad, right? We want to warn at under 10% and alert at under 1% or so. Maybe 3% would be a better place to put that. And I say percentages, even though we've got boxes now with 128 gigs, 256 gigs of RAM. There's actually a server that I saw the other day that can hold 2 terabytes of RAM, which is just unbelievable to me. So in those cases, you might take that with a grain of salt as your counter. If you're under 100 megs though, your box is done, right? So this is pretty obvious. We do also see that we're running up on the percent of committed bytes in use. But in this case, we ran just out of memory. We just ran out of RAM. A little less frequently to do that. Never quite got to 100% committed bytes in use. And 82 is a pretty darn low number. So what we're going to look at is a process that maybe sucked away our RAM, right? So that counter is the working set. So we should be able to see a process that has consumed all of the working set on this box. So we'll dump that in there, go dump our total out, get rid of it, and we can do this the quick and dirty way, and just hold down the shift key, and probably almost forgot. Probably should have this graph up where we can see it, right? So we want to throw some zeros in here until we get all of our counters where we can see them on the graph, and that's pretty obviously going to show me some interesting stuff, so I might just stop right there, even though I can see that there's some of that process that in fact will be left behind. So I can click once again on this first working set counter and hold my shift down and just keep on scrolling through here until I find the one that I'm looking for, or since there's so many counters here that are glued to the bottom and it's not going to get in my visual field of vision, I could just reach over and click on the counter with the highlighter on. There we go. And I can see that that's pretty obviously going to be one of my culprits, especially if I take the available megabytes counter and scale him up so that I can see it. And again, we might even scale him up one notch higher. So you can see this is a complete inverse counter, but a very, very relevant inverse counter. We have a relationship here of available megabytes, which is a measure of how many we got left. And we've got another right here, which is how many am I taking? So if we have how many is there left and how many am I using, they will obviously be inverse counters. And let's bump this up just a little higher to get that. Oop, that's too high. That was too high. So 10,000 was actually the better place to be here. So right there. And might even be possible to get a little bit more granular here. Just bump it up a little so I can get some of that. There we go. Now we can kind of see the full pattern, right? So lost the RAM, had a bunch of RAM taken up by one process. There's your culprit, right? And who was it? Well, not surprisingly, it was test limit, because we fired it off and told it to do that. And in most cases, these really are about this easy to troubleshoot. Something took all my RAM. Here's where it was. It's not any different than what you would have done as if you were in Task Manager troubleshooting this live. You would have used Task Manager or Resource Monitor, just sorted by the memory use on a process, and bing, bang, there it is. This is the same process. It's just using perfmon. And why is that important? Well, because perfmon runs without you having to sit there and stare at it. So that's very, very important to have a tool like that available for you to do that. There's one other side note I want to mention here, and it's a counter we haven't really covered. And it's important for us to take a second and talk about it, because every once in a while you won't find an actual counter that is matching up to your or a process that is matching up to your loss of memory, and you can't even find it in there. One of two things is probably happening. Thing one would be the instance where you have 7,000 processes and every one of them is taking 10 megs of memory. So you need to look for patterns like that, because what that will show is just a whole lot of little bitty processes with little bitty memory, but if they're spawning lots of them, you need to look through if you don't see one blaringly obvious one standing out there. The other one right here is system cache resident bytes. It's a counter you don't hear very often, but it's one that will happen to suck up a whole lot of your memory. In this case it's not, and I can't actually simulate that because what you really usually need is like a hard drive that's going bad or something and is no longer picking up writes. And so the system's having to cache that. I actually was able to simulate it once with a USB thumb drive, and I wasn't able to do it again, but I did once get some pretty good counters on that, but I've never figured out a good live way to do it. So that's kind of the two notes there. Look for multiple processes if you can't find one single process that matches up to your pattern. And if that's just not working for you, come and look at system cache. If this is increasing and taking large amounts of memory, keeping in mind that this is a bytes counter and you are measuring in megabytes, so looking at your average min-max graphs, you may find that there may be a hardware problem that is causing system cache to flood. You could actually see on a 32-bit system this go up to about 1 gigabyte, and on a 64-bit system it'll actually take up as much as a terabyte, which is just ridiculous, right? I mean, if you actually have a terabyte of memory in your box and this thing's taking it all up, then you're going to wonder, where did my memory go? Well, that's a good place to look if you can't find it in the processes. So as promised, I told you that particular type of a memory leak condition was a little less common, so it wouldn't be nearly as difficult or time-consuming to teach the process of troubleshooting that. It just sort of rolls right on back into what we learned in the previous episode, so we were able to keep this episode conveniently shorter than the slightly longer episode last time. And as promised, this will be about all we need to cover to get through the memory leaks when it comes to processes and user mode. The next pieces we're going to be using, next parts of this series, we're going to be talking about fake memory, virtual address space for both the kernel and processes, and that gets interesting since processes don't really have a good visibility to what actual memory we are covering in this episode and the last episode. There's two completely separate ways that works, and that'll be a very interesting topic to get into on our next round, and I'm looking forward to filming that. So anyway guys, this has been Chris with Microsoft. As always, I thank you so much for watching. If you did find anything about this video useful or interesting, if you would just take a second, give it a quick like. That helps other people to find the video if they're out searching for similar topics. Also feel free to subscribe to my channel. That way you'll get notified anytime I put up a new video. And also my blog is at 9z.com. It's really super easy to remember, just the last number and the last letter .com. That's also got links to my Facebook, my LinkedIn, my Twitter, and my TechNet blog. So again, as always, thanks a ton for listening everybody, and I will see you in the next episode.